Chapter 6, Postal Voting.
Charlene, earlier on we mentioned postal voting. We need to explain to our viewers what is postal voting and how such postal votes are to be processed.
Oh, but indeed, we cannot complete voting without addressing the special case of voting by post. This is called postal voting. Tafadzwa, please help us understand what exactly is postal voting. As we have said, it is so important that we explain this to everybody.
Indeed, Charlene, it is important to explain to all, especially the presiding officers, what is postal voting and how one is to process such postal votes.
Before we get into the details, however, it is important for us to understand that not all polling stations will have postal votes. Furthermore, not all voters are eligible to apply for postal voting. The electoral law recognizes that there may be special instances where a voter may not be able to present himself or herself on polling day at his or her designated polling station. Section 72 of the electoral law lists the following voters as being eligible to apply for postal voting. Please note that a voter on polling day will be unable to vote at his or her assigned polling station, as he or she will be on duty as a member of a disciplined force or an electoral officer,
Or on duty in the service of the government outside Zimbabwe,
or a voter who is outside Zimbabwe as the spouse of a person on duty in the service of the government outside Zimbabwe is eligible to apply for postal voting. As described in Section 73, qualifying individuals must apply for postal votes to the Chief Elections Officer using the prescribed form, such that it is received not later than noon on the 14th day after nomination day. Please note that any polling staff that will be on duty at the very same polling station that they have registered as voters do not need to apply for postal voting. Instead, as was explained earlier on, these individuals will be processed in the same way as ordinary voters registered at the polling station.
will you explain to us how these postal votes will be received by the election officials?
The filled-in postal ballots must be sealed by the voter in the prescribed envelopes and forwarded to the Chief Elections Officer by registered post, courier, or a diplomatic pouch. These completed postal ballots must be received by the Chief Elections Officer not later than noon on the 14th day before polling day. The Chief Elections Officer will then ensure that each postal voter envelope is sorted and forwarded to its appropriate constituency elections officer, such that it arrives no later than 7 days before polling day. In turn, the constituency elections officer is responsible for ensuring that each postal voter envelope is resorted and packaged such that it will be handed over to the presiding officer of the specific polling station that the voter's name appears on. After being separated into specific polling stations, these sorted postal voter envelopes will remain closed and will be sealed either inside a tamper-evident envelope or in a dedicated ballot box marked as Postal Ballot Box for polling station code XYZ. 3 days before polling day, the presiding officer will receive his or her polling station kit comprising of ballot boxes, ballot papers, voters' roll, polling booths, and so on. All of this from the constituency elections officer. The presiding officer will also receive a register of the postal voters for his or her polling station, as well as all the matching postal voter envelopes received by the Chief Elections Officer. Note that at none of the above stages is anyone permitted to unseal these postal voting envelopes, nor to see how a voter has marked his or her ballot. The unsealing of the postal envelopes will be described later on. Also note that there may be individual voters that registered as postal voters but did not manage to return by post their envelopes to the Chief Elections Officer in the time prescribed by law.
Wow! Sorting of these postal envelopes sounds like a considerable challenge. Explain to our viewers what information is available on the outside of the postal voter envelopes that will aid in the sorting out process.
Indeed, it can be a considerable sorting exercise owing to its scale. However, it is quite straightforward. Each postal voter envelope will bear the voter's full name, national ID number, the province, district, constituency, ward, and polling station name. In addition to this information, the polling station code will also be shown. This polling station code is unique to each and every polling station. Using this code, sorting is greatly simplified.
Explain what measures are in place to ensure that a person registered as a postal voter will, on polling day, not also come to the polling station and cast a second ballot as an ordinary voter.
Tafaza, that is a very, very good point. Remember that we said that voters' rolls are now polling station specific? Well, that simply means that any voter's name will appear once and only once on just one polling station voter's roll out of all the voters' roll throughout the country. One of the actions that must be performed by the presiding officer before polling commences is to check that all voters within the register of postal voters for that polling station have indeed been marked PV written next to his or her name. In case the respective voter's name was not already marked PV, then this must be done by the presiding officer. But be careful. In some cases, there may be more than one person with the same name and surname on the same polling station voter's roll.
Do ensure that the correct voter's record is crossed out by confirming that the national identification number is indeed the same.
Now, on polling day, if any voter that registered as a postal voter comes to the polling station to cast his or her ballot, it will be detected by the voters' roll officer that he or she is a postal voter, a PV voter, and will be turned away. Note that as in other turned away cases, the details of the voter and the reason for turning him or her away must be recorded by the recording officer. As we can see, it is thus not possible for anyone to bypass the checks and balances of the system so as to vote twice by seeking to exploit the ordinary polling process and the postal voting process.
It's so great to know that the checks and balances of the voting process is so well thought out. Now, kindly explain to our viewers when these postal votes will be processed and how they will be incorporated into the election results.
Polling will commence on polling day at 7 a.m. sharp and close once the last voter that was standing in the queue by 7 p.m. has cast his or her vote. If there are no postal voters for that polling station, then the ballot boxes would be closed by having their apertures closed and sealed. However, in the case where there are postal vote envelopes received for that polling station, the process is slightly different.
After the last voter is cast his or her ballot, then the presiding officer will announce to all present that the ordinary polling has been completed. However, the ballot boxes will not yet be sealed.
The presiding officer will then announce to all present, especially election agents and observers, that the postal votes will now be processed.
The presiding officer will announce the number of registered postal votes for that polling station, as well as number of postal envelopes received.
Each postal vote envelope will be processed one by one as follows. The postal voter's name and national ID is announced by the presiding officer.
The voter's roll officer will locate the voter's record and confirm that it is indeed marked as PV. If so, the postal voter's name will be crossed out and
Without unfolding the ballot, nor anyone looking at how the voter has marked his or her ballot paper, the polling station's secret mark will be stamped on the outside of the folded ballot paper.
It will then be placed in its appropriate ballot box.
Please note that in the case of multiple concurrent elections, this process must be repeated by processing all ballot papers from a single voter simultaneously.
In the case where the voter's record cannot be found on that polling station's voter's roll, or
in the case where the voter's record was found but it is not marked as PV voter's record and it does not exist on the register of postal voters for that polling station, then the postal vote must be rejected. In such an instance, the recording officer must record the relevant attempted postal voter's information as well as the reason why the postal voter's envelope was rejected. All such rejected postal voters' envelopes must remain sealed and no one is permitted to find out how the voter marked his or her ballot paper. After all the postal votes have been processed, then the ballot boxes will be closed by having their apertures closed and sealed in preparation for results counting. The counting process will proceed as normal.
A quick question on postal voting. If a voter has registered as a postal voter but was unable to post the envelope on time to the Chief Elections Officer, will the voter be then allowed to turn up at his or her assigned polling station and deposit his or her ballot papers in the relevant ballot boxes?
Unfortunately, Tafadzwa, this will not be possible. Let me just make this clear. A registered postal voter will not be allowed to deposit the ballot papers provided to him or her via post at his or her polling station on polling day, nor will that voter be allowed to vote as an ordinary voter. The reason for this is that as part of the results counting process, a strict ballot paper account is maintained all the way from the ZEC head office down to the individual polling station level. Postal ballots received by the Chief Elections Officer are taken into account at head office level. The number of ballot papers issued to every polling station is also strictly kept track of. If postal voters were permitted to deposit their ballot paper directly at polling stations themselves, then the ballot paper accounts would not balance.